The skyline of Dubai glittered in the soft, golden hues of twilight. Skyscrapers stood tall like monuments to ambition and opulence, their glass facade mirroring the desert sun. Amid this luxury, life moved with a glossy perfection. But for Amina, it was a prison hidden behind the gleaming facade of privilege. Amina was the quintessential picture of grace and beauty. In her late 20s, she had luminous fair skin, dark curls that framed her face like a halo, and eyes that seemed to hold both longing and melancholy. Wrapped in flowing abayas adorned with intricate embroidery, she presented herself as the perfect wife of Khaled, a successful businessman. Yet beneath the surface, Amina's heart wrestled with an unspoken emptiness. Her marriage to Khaled had started as a picture-perfect union. Khaled, in his mid-30s, exuded confidence with his sharp jawline, meticulously trimmed beard, and commanding demeanor. He was the head of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, a man of immense influence and charm. He had won over her parents with his devotion to family, tradition, and status qualities that had initially drawn Amina to him. But as the years wore on, the foundation of their relationship began to erode. Khaled's devotion to work overshadowed his attention to her, and the vibrant connection they once shared had dulled into routine. The intimacy of shared laughter and whispered secrets was replaced by sporadic gestures, a dinner date here, a fleeting compliment there. His world revolved around contracts, meetings, and architectural blueprints, while hers shrank to the confines of their sprawling villa. The villa was a masterpiece, a sprawling estate adorned with Persian rugs, antique furniture, and artwork that celebrated tradition. Yet for Amina, it felt suffocating. The very walls seemed to amplify her solitude. Her days were filled with hosting dinners, attending charity events, and managing household staff, all while putting on a facade of contentment. Inside, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Every so often, Amina sought refuge outside her gilded cage. She would wander the streets aimlessly, searching for a way to fill the void in her heart. It was on one of these aimless excursions that she stumbled upon a small horse stable tucked away on the outskirts of the city, hidden from the glitz and glamour of Dubai. The stable was a stark contrast to the opulence Amina was accustomed to. Sand and sun dominated the landscape, and the air smelled of hay and leather. But it was here that she found an inexplicable sense of peace. Magnificent Arabian horses grazed lazily or galloped gracefully in their paddocks. Their muscular bodies, flowing manes, and soulful eyes captivated her. An elderly Bedouin man named Abdul greeted her warmly. With his weathered skin and kind, knowing eyes, Abdul carried an air of wisdom that put Amina at ease. He spoke in soft, melodic tones, sharing stories about the horses and their connection to their riders. Amina found herself drawn to his words and to the animals themselves. She began visiting the stable regularly, escaping the monotony of her life under the guise of running errands. Among the horses there was one that stood out, Zishan, a stunning black stallion. His coat shimmered in the sunlight like polished obsidian, and his amber eyes seemed to pierce through her soul. From the moment they met, Amina felt an unspoken connection with Zishan, one that transcended the boundaries of human and animal. Zishan became her confidant, her silent witness to the turmoil she couldn't share with anyone else. She would spend hours grooming him, talking to him about her dreams, her frustrations, and her longing for freedom. Zishan would nuzzle her hand gently, as if to reassure her, and Amina felt understood in a way she hadn't in years. Each visit to the stable became a sacred ritual. Away from the judging eyes of Dubai's elite, she felt free to laugh, to cry, to feel alive. The stable was her sanctuary, a world where societal expectations and marital obligations didn't exist. But as Amina's bond with Zishan deepened, it stirred feelings she hadn't allowed herself to confront. Her heart raced when she approached him, and a strange mix of exhilaration and fear coursed through her veins. It wasn't just about the horse, it was what Zishan represented, a rebellion against the life she had been forced to live. Her connection to Zishan became a source of both joy and torment. It was a love affair of sorts, but not in the way society might define it. Amina knew that her visits to the stable were a dangerous secret, one that could unravel the delicate threads of her carefully constructed life. Yet the allure was too strong, the freedom too intoxicating. At home, Khaled remained oblivious to her escapades, consumed by his work and the demands of his empire. His absence, both physical and emotional, only magnified Amina's yearning for something more. She lied to him effortlessly now, weaving excuses about visiting friends or shopping trips to cover her visits to the stable. Each lie drove a deeper wedge between them, but Amina couldn't stop. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Yet deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. The days turned into weeks, and Amina found herself increasingly consumed by her secret life. But the façade she maintained at home grew thinner with each passing day. The tension between her public persona and her private yearnings threatened to tear her apart. What Amina didn't realize was that her carefully hidden world was on the verge of collapse, and the price of her pursuit of freedom would soon become unbearably high. The soft sands of the desert stretched endlessly, golden waves rippling under the intense Dubai sun. For Amina, the stable had become her escape, a world far removed from the expectations of her gilded life. Zishan, the majestic black stallion, was not just a horse, he was her confidant, her partner in defiance, and a symbol of the freedom she craved. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of unraveling. Amina's visits to the stable grew more frequent and more reckless. She no longer meticulously planned her excuses to Khaled. Instead, she brushed off his inquiries with vague answers about shopping or charity work. Khaled's indifference made her deception easier, but it also deepened the void between them.
As Amina stood in the paddock one evening, running her fingers through Zishan's silky mane, Abdul approached her with a cautious smile. The old Bedouin had grown fond of Amina, but he wasn't blind to the storm brewing in her life. "You carry a heavy burden, child," Abdul said gently, his weathered voice tinged with concern. Amina paused, her hand resting on Zishan's neck. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life, Abdul?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded knowingly. "The desert teaches us that the heart will always seek its own path, no matter how much we try to bury it. But paths carved in secrecy often lead to pain." Amina turned away, unwilling to face the wisdom in his words. She knew the risks she was taking. Her feelings for Zishan, what they represented, had become a dangerous obsession, but she couldn't stop. The stable was the only place where she felt truly alive. One afternoon, as Amina rode Zishan through the dunes, the wind whipping through her hair, she allowed herself to imagine a life free from the constraints of her marriage. The horse moved with a grace and power that seemed to echo her own suppressed desires. In those fleeting moments, she felt untouchable. But reality was far less forgiving. Khaled, ever the meticulous businessman, had started noticing the cracks in her stories. The vague explanations, the missed events, the distant look in her eyes, it was all too obvious. Suspicion gnawed at him, though he struggled to believe that his perfectly poised wife could harbor secrets of such magnitude. Driven by doubt, Khaled hired a private investigator. He didn't share his suspicions with anyone, not even Amina. Instead, he watched from the shadows as the investigator pieced together the fragments of Amina's secret life. The first reports were inconclusive: visits to a stable, time spent with horses. It seemed harmless enough, but the frequency of her visits and the hours she spent there began to paint a more complicated picture. Amina, oblivious to Khaled's growing suspicions, continued to find solace at the stable. Her connection with Zishan deepened, not just as a rider and her horse but as a confidant for her unspoken thoughts and feelings. She would press her forehead to his, close her eyes, and whisper her fears and dreams as though he could understand every word. "You're the only one who truly sees me," she murmured to him one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a warm amber glow. Zishan nickered softly in response, his amber eyes reflecting the fading light. That night, Khaled confronted her for the first time. As they sat across the dinner table, he put down his phone, a rare occurrence, and looked directly at her. "You've been distant, Amina," he began, his voice measured but probing. "Where do you go all these afternoons?" Amina froze, her mind racing to craft a plausible lie. "I've been visiting friends," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's nothing to worry about." But Khaled wasn't convinced. His dark eyes bore into hers, searching for cracks in her façade. "Friends," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "You've never mentioned these friends before." Amina's heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure. "I needed some space, Khaled," she said, her voice steady. "You're always so busy, and I've felt a bit lonely." Khaled leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't press further that night, but the seed of doubt had taken root, and it would only grow. Days later, the investigator delivered the evidence Khaled had been dreading: photos of Amina at the stable, her tender moments with Zishan, her obvious affection for the horse. Khaled's initial reaction was disbelief. How could his wife, a woman of grace, tradition, and poise, be involved in something so unthinkable? Rage simmered beneath the surface, but Khaled kept his emotions in check. He needed more proof, a way to confront her without giving her a chance to deny the truth. The investigator continued his surveillance, and the picture became clearer: Amina's frequent visits, her evasive behavior, her increasing detachment from her role as his wife. One evening, as Amina prepared to leave the villa, Khaled stopped her. "Where are you going this time?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. Amina hesitated, her hand tightening on the strap of her handbag. "To a charity meeting," she lied. Khaled stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'll come with you," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Panic flickered in Amina's chest, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "It's a women-only event," she said, hoping he would drop the subject. Khaled studied her for a moment before nodding. "Be careful," he said, his voice deceptively calm. As Amina left the villa, her heart raced. She felt the weight of Khaled's gaze on her back, a reminder that her double life was becoming harder to maintain. At the stable, she found solace in Zishan's presence, but even there, a shadow of unease crept into her thoughts. Abdul noticed her restlessness and approached her cautiously. "Secrets are like sand in the wind, Amina," he said softly. "No matter how tightly you try to hold them, they'll eventually slip through your fingers." Amina looked away, unable to face the truth in his words. She had built her sanctuary on a foundation of lies, and she knew it couldn't last. But the thought of giving up her connection to Zishan, her only source of joy, was unbearable. What Amina didn't realize was that Khaled was already planning his next move. The stable, once her refuge, would soon become the stage for a confrontation that would shatter the fragile balance of her life. The desert was cloaked in the warm hues of sunset, a serene silence draping the endless expanse of sand. Amina rode Zishan through the dunes, her heart lightened by the fleeting sense of freedom the moment offered. She leaned forward, whispering into the stallion's ear as if he could understand her words. This was her sanctuary, the only place where she felt truly herself, untouched by the burdens of her marriage or the suffocating expectations of Dubai's elite society. But even the desert couldn't shield her from the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Khaled had grown tired of waiting for the truth to surface. The investigator's reports had left no doubt in his mind: Amina's obsession with the horse wasn't merely a diversion, it was a betrayal. His pride, his family's name, his very identity, everything was at stake. Rage, jealousy, and confusion coiled within him like a snake ready to strike. That evening, as Amina prepared for yet another visit to the stable, Khaled decided he would follow her. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, to witness the truth that had been tearing his marriage apart. The drive to the stable was uneventful, the city lights fading into the distance as the desert stretched out before him. Khaled gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with images of Amina and the horse. The investigator's photos were burned into his memory, Amina brushing Zishan's coat, her face alight with an expression he hadn't seen in years. As he approached the stable, Khaled parked his car at a distance and stepped out into the cool desert air. The stable was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of hay and the soft whinnying of horses. He moved cautiously, staying in the shadows as he searched for Amina. He didn't have to wait long. Amina emerged from the stables, leading Zishan by the reins. She wore a simple riding outfit, her hair tucked beneath a scarf. Khaled's breath caught in his throat as he watched her. There was a lightness in her step, a radiance in her face that he hadn't seen in years. She mounted the horse with practiced ease and began to ride toward the dunes. Fueled by anger and betrayal, Khaled returned to his car and followed her at a distance. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. Amina rode with abandon, her laughter carried on the wind as Zishan galloped across the desert. For a moment, she felt invincible, as though nothing could touch her in this vast, untamed world. But that illusion shattered when she saw Khaled's car in the distance. A chill ran down her spine as the vehicle approached, kicking up a cloud of dust. Zishan sensed her tension and slowed his pace, his ears flicking back as though attuned to the shift in her mood. Khaled stopped his car and stepped out, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes fixed on Amina with an intensity that made her heart pound. She dismounted quickly, her pulse racing as she tried to anticipate what he would say or do. "What are you doing here, Amina?" Khaled demanded, his voice sharp and unrelenting. Amina's mind raced, searching for an explanation, but the truth was written in the sand between them. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she held Zishan's reins. "I come here to think," she said, her voice barely audible. "To escape." "Escape?" Khaled's voice rose, laced with incredulity and anger. "From what? Your perfect life? Your perfect husband?" The bitterness in his words cut through her like a blade. "You wouldn't understand," she replied, her voice steadier now. "You've never cared to ask what I need, what I feel." Khaled took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "And this is what you need? This, horse?" His voice dripped with disdain, the words almost spat out. "It's not about the horse," Amina shot back, her voice rising with frustration. "It's about me. About finding a part of myself that I lost a long time ago." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, the unspoken truths and buried resentments rising to the surface. Khaled's jaw tightened as he struggled to contain his emotions. He turned his gaze to Zishan, the stallion standing calmly at Amina's side, and something inside him snapped. "This animal," Khaled said, his voice low and venomous, "has come between us. You've chosen him over your husband, your family, your reputation." Amina's eyes widened with fear as Khaled took another step toward Zishan. "Don't," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Please, Khaled, don't do this." But Khaled was beyond reason. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a nearby rock, his movements driven by jealousy and a sense of betrayal so deep it blinded him to the consequences. The scene unfolded in a blur. Amina screamed as Khaled raised the rock, her voice piercing the desert silence. Zishan reared up in alarm, his powerful hooves striking the air as he sensed the danger. In the chaos, Amina tried to intervene, to protect the horse that had become her lifeline. But it was too late. Khaled's actions set off a chain of events that neither of them could control. As Zishan bolted, the reins slipped from Amina's hands, and she lost her footing on the uneven sand. Khaled, still clutching the rock, turned his fury toward her. "You've humiliated me, Amina," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You've destroyed everything." In a moment of blind desperation, Khaled struck. The force of the blow sent Amina crumpling to the ground, her body limp against the unforgiving sand. The world seemed to hold its breath as silence enveloped the desert, broken only by the distant sound of Zishan's retreating hooves. Khaled stood frozen, the rock slipping from his hand as the reality of what he'd done sank in. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at Amina's motionless form. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Unbeknownst to him, the investigator Khaled had hired had followed him to the desert, watching the confrontation from a distance. The detective, hidden among the dunes, had witnessed everything, the argument, the rage, and the devastating final act. The detective immediately called the authorities, his hands trembling as he relayed the events. Within minutes, the wail of sirens broke the desert stillness, their piercing cries heralding the end of Khaled's carefully curated life. As the police arrived and secured the scene, Khaled remained rooted to the spot, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He offered no resistance as they placed him in handcuffs, his once imposing figure reduced to a broken man consumed by his own actions. The desert, once Amina's sanctuary, became the stage for her tragic end, a place where secrets unraveled and lives were forever altered. The courtroom was suffused with tension, its walls echoing with the murmur of whispered speculation. Dubai's elite had turned their attention to the trial, eager for details of a scandal that had torn apart one of their own. Reporters gathered outside in throngs, their cameras flashing incessantly as Khaled, once the epitome of a composed and successful businessman, was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Inside, Amina's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and anger. They had lost their daughter in a moment of senseless violence, and now they demanded justice. Khaled sat at the defendant's table, his head bowed, his once confident posture now a shadow of its former self. The prosecutor wasted no time painting a picture of Khaled as a jealous, enraged husband who had allowed his emotions to spiral out of control. Evidence was laid bare for the court, the private investigator's damning report, photos of Amina at the stable, and, most chilling of all, eyewitness testimony from the investigator who had seen the murder unfold. As the defendant struck his wife in the desert that day, it was not just a crime of passion, the prosecutor argued, his voice steady and deliberate. It was the culmination of control, rage, and the belief that his reputation was more valuable than the life of another human being. Amina's affair, or her perceived affair, as the prosecutor emphasized, was explored in painstaking detail. Photos of her with Zishan, the moments of tenderness she had shared with the horse, became fodder for debate. Society's judgment was swift, with many branding her as a disgrace to the traditional values she had once embodied. Others, however, saw her as a tragic figure, a woman crushed under the weight of societal expectations and emotional neglect. Khaled's defense attorney attempted to frame the murder as an act of temporary insanity, brought on by the betrayal Khaled believed he had suffered. He was pushed to his breaking point, the lawyer argued, his voice pleading. Khaled is not a violent man, but on that day, his emotions overwhelmed him. He acted in the heat of the moment, and he deeply regrets his actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The detective's testimony was clear and precise, detailing how Khaled had followed Amina to the stable, how he had confronted her in the desert, and how the situation had escalated into a moment of fatal violence. In the courtroom, Khaled remained largely silent. His expression was vacant, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance as if he were reliving the events of that day over and over again. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and struck multi-million-dollar deals was now reduced to a broken figure, stripped of his power and status. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as Khaled was led away, his fate sealed. In the days that followed, Dubai's glittering social circles were consumed by whispers of the tragedy. Amina's death became a cautionary tale, a story that exposed the cracks in the façade of perfection that so many in her world worked tirelessly to maintain. Her family mourned her privately, shielding themselves from the media frenzy. They spoke little of the affair or the circumstances surrounding her death, choosing instead to remember Amina as the vibrant, graceful woman she had once been. Zishan, the stallion at the center of the tragedy, was quietly sold off. The stable owner, Abdul, had no choice but to part with the horse that had unwittingly become a symbol of forbidden love and scandal. No one knew where Zishan went, and for Amina's family, that was perhaps for the best. The horse had become too closely tied to the memories of their daughter's tragic end. For Khaled, life in prison was a slow, agonizing descent into obscurity. The man who had once been admired for his business acumen and charm was now forgotten, his name reduced to a footnote in the tale of Amina's life and death. In the confines of his cell, he replayed the events of that day over and over, haunted by the knowledge that his actions had destroyed everything he once held dear. The media dissected every aspect of the story, from Amina's supposed affair to Khaled's jealousy and the societal pressures that had shaped their lives. Some articles painted Amina as a victim of her circumstances, a woman whose longing for freedom had been stifled by tradition and neglect. Others were less sympathetic, portraying her as a cautionary example of what happens when one strays from the path of duty and propriety. But beyond the headlines and the gossip, Amina's story lingered in the collective memory as a tragedy rooted in unfulfilled desires and unmet expectations. It was a reminder of the cost of secrecy and the devastating consequences of letting love, duty, and jealousy collide. Years later, the villa that had once been Amina's home stood empty, its opulence untouched but its halls eerily silent. The stable where Zishan had lived remained a quiet, forgotten place on the outskirts of the city, its once vibrant paddocks now overgrown with weeds. For those who knew the story, the image of Amina, radiant and alive as she rode through the desert on Zishan, remained a bittersweet memory. She had sought freedom in a world that gave her none, and in her quest to reclaim a sense of self, she had paid the ultimate price. In the end, Amina's life and death became more than just a scandal, they became a reflection of the fragile balance between desire and duty, love and loyalty, freedom and conformity. Her story was a stark reminder of the weight of societal expectations and the human cost of living a life untrue to oneself. And as the sands of the desert shifted endlessly with the wind, so too did the whispers of her name, fading into history but never truly forgotten.